For the first time in years, but what feels like decades, Canadians nationwide returned to the polls for an election. At the head of the largest two parties, new blood, as neither leader has directly campaigned to become the Prime Minister previously. Before I get any further, I need you to hear this. On April 28th, you need to get out and vote, even if you live in the red heart of Toronto and you feel like your ballot isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Vote. Vote to make it close. Vote to show the next government that you care. Vote to win this, for you and for your family and for every Canadian. Vote for affordability for the rural family in Alberta and for the single mother in Vancouver. Vote for the elderly widow in line at the food bank, and vote for the homeless man standing in line behind her. Vote for the law-abiding family that might be the next home invasion victims. Vote for the police officer arresting the same criminal for the 20th time. Vote for the family of the addict, praying he gets clean before he encounters fentanyl for the final time. Vote to make the last 10 years history. And vote so they don't happen again. Now let's talk about Mark Carney. The current Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has been in his position for about a week, after winning the Liberal Party leadership race. The opposition, Pierre Poilievre, has been in his position since shortly after the previous election, taking over for the anemic Aaron O'Toole. Mark Carney is, technically, the first Prime Minister since 2015 besides Justin Trudeau, and if Canada chooses right, he will be the shortest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history. Current polls show that the race will be tight, and Carney might have a chance. But I disagree. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but when people know the truth about him and his motives, I think his chances will go down dramatically. We've been in situations very recently where an 11th hour candidate receives a nice polling bump just before an election. Not in Canada, however, but south, Kamala Harris. To be fair, there are two key differences between Kamala Harris and Mark Carney. The first is that Kamala entered the race months before the election, not weeks. The second is that Kamala Harris is a moronic, unlikable woman and separately attached to the worst presidency since the Carter administration. Now, that's not to say that Carney is inseparable from the waking nightmare that is Justin Trudeau's Canada. But Carney wasn't Trudeau's number two. That position belonged to Chrystia Freeland, another unlikable woman. When Justin Trudeau's ship was sinking, she went down with him. First, she was forced to resign as finance minister just before presenting a long overdue economic statement with a $60 billion deficit. She was forced out for the crime of thinking that a government putting up that size of a deficit has some serious problems behind the scene. Then, she ran against Carney in the Liberal leadership race, but she had lost it before it even begun. Carney had much the same name recognition as her, without the baggage of being the deputy prime minister of a woefully inept government. As a result, the leadership race was won by Mark Carney. Carney has the advantage of not being so directly associated with Justin Trudeau. Now, with the attention of the world on him, he's rebranding himself as a moderate. He's promising tax cuts to Canadians and backing this up by scrapping the consumer fuel charge as Prime Minister. I imagine this was hard for him to do, like he was beating his dog to death with a copy of the Carbon Tax Act. The carbon tax has been the Liberals' line in the sand for years. For the sake of the planet, they add 75 cents per gigajoule each year until the planet is saved. That is cumulative, by the way. So intently did the Liberals yearn for the carbon tax that they gave birth to one of the Conservative campaign's slogans, Axe the Tax. Now, Carbon Tax Carney beat Poilievre to it, and in doing so, punched his former climate efforts in the balls. They become your friend by making life a little bit more affordable for everyday Canadians, hoping that you forget they are the reason you can't make ends meet in the first place. Naturally, included in scrapping the consumer fuel charge is scrapping the Canada carbon rebate. Many hours in Parliament have been filled with Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney claiming that the Canada carbon rebate pays families more than they pay in carbon tax, when the reality is it does not replace what it takes. The funny part is, when Mark Carney repealed the carbon tax, he supposedly did it on live TV by signing an order in council, similar to an executive order signed by the President of the United States. But here's the thing. Mark Carney can't sign order in councils. Justin Trudeau couldn't sign order in councils because the Prime Minister isn't technically the leader of Canada. The Governor-General is, in place of the King, because Canada is a constitutional monarchy. So only the GG can sign an OIC. So while Carney talks about how he's just a guy, not a politician, not Donald Trump, not some faker, he literally does what Donald Trump did for the first few days of presidency, except he faked it. At least Trump was signing a real executive order. On the topic of tax, he's pledged to reduce the lowest income tax rate by about 1%, which saves Canadians approximately $50 a month, which sounds nice. But by the way, the Conservatives have also just pledged to lower the lowest tax bracket rate by 2.25%, which saved Canadians approximately $100 a month, and in total lowering their current income tax bill by 15%. He's also floated the idea of stopping the increase of the capital gains inclusion factor. However, this was done before he even stepped foot in the Liberal leadership race. The moment Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament for the Liberal leadership race, all unpassed bills on the table were nullified. This includes the increase in the capital gains inclusion factor. Oddly enough, Mark Carney knows this. At least he should. He worked in the finance sector for decades. He rubs elbows with high-ups in the World Economic Forum and the Bilderberg Group. He worked in international finance institutions all over the planet. He knows how these things work. He also knows when to move a company to a more profitable country, and that's what he did. As the chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, one of the largest public companies in Canada, he and the board approved the move of Brookfield to New York City, a city that is widely known for being in America, which is now run by Donald Trump. According to Brookfield, the change is purely technical. Yeah, moving the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar company is usually technical with no real-world ramifications. Oh, and by the way, he also has deferred share units of Brookfield, basically glorified stock options that are worth over $3 million. And on top of that, $1.7 million in normal stock options. And if you know how options work, you know that the more Brookfield is worth, the more free money Carney gets. So while he claims to be no longer employed by Brookfield Asset Management, he still maintains heavy interest in the company to the tune of $5 million. Oh, and by the way, he stands to make capital gains off the future sale of those shares. So, of course, he doesn't want to increase the capital gains inclusion rate. That could cost him, specifically, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, for a guy who's supposedly interested in fixing Canada's economic state, he's also actively campaigning on a huge waste of taxpayer money. Time for my favorite soapbox, guns. In the recent Liberal leadership race, Carney said he would push for Trudeau's firearms confiscation scheme. That is insanely hard to say. Trudeau's firearms confiscation compensation scheme. In other words, a gun buyback program. The idea of the program is to knock on the doors of licensed Canadian gun owners and pay them pennies on the dollar for their quote-unquote assault-style weapons. The problem with this plan is that the government can't afford to buy back all these guns and transport them and destroy them all. For one, they would never find them all. Two, they can't use Canada Post to transport these guns, as Canada Post has already refused to transport any weapons for this program on the basis of safety. Three, Canada can't afford this program. The gun buyback program has already cost Canada over $67 million, and for that price, they have confiscated exactly 0 guns. The reason is because they're making payments to shell companies that aren't doing anything. They spent over $9 million on a company called Sampson and Associates, which lists some guy's house as one of their mailing addresses. That's real. The CCFR has an episode about it, and I will link it in the show notes. If you don't know, the CCFR is the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. They're great. Subscribe to them and me. And the reality of the situation is that Canada doesn't have a gun problem, at least not one caused by illegal gun owners. The bar for ownership in Canada is pretty high, and everybody licensed to own a firearm has their criminal record checked every single day. The RCMP is notified whenever a gun is transferred, and Canadians who have a gun license are statistically the least dangerous people in the country. On average, 12 license holders are accused of a homicide each year. 12 out of over 2 million license holders in Canada. Oh, and there are roughly 800 homicides in Canada each year. So if you do the math, that's less than 2% of homicides that might be committed by license holders. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I will link to an article by a group called Justice for Gun Owners. They have lots of really good breakdowns of the numbers, and they go after Stats Canada for getting the real truth, not the narrative. Not to mention that handguns, the most commonly used weapon in firearms crime, are now virtually impossible to acquire, and yet gun crime only grows. Now, Mark Carney doesn't care about this. Illegal immigrants and gang members don't vote. woke city elites in Toronto and Vancouver do, and they don't like guns, and they also don't read statistics. So let's take away guns so they can feel happy knowing that the most trustworthy people in the whole country aren't armed and can't protect their family from the growing homicide and home invasion rates. No, if Canada has a gun problem, it's caused by illegal guns, and Mark Carney doesn't care about those. Recently, Stats Canada revealed that known illegal gun imports have nearly tripled since the Liberals took over in 2015. The reason for this is because 99% of shipping containers entering Canada go unchecked by the Canada Border Services Agency. But don't worry, the Liberal government has a solution to this. Cut $68 million in funding from an agency that's already horrifically underfunded and understaffed. The fact of the matter is that the only people with effective weapons in Canada are the government and the gangs, and neither of them really care about what the others are doing, just as long as it doesn't bother them. The Liberal government's approach to criminal justice is simple. Take an extra large dose of laxative and take a criminally huge dump all over law-abiding citizens. The moral of the story is that Mark Carney is about as genuine as the $12 Rolex he bought on Temu that runs backwards. He's just another Canadian now. He's just your friend now. He's cutting the carbon tax now. But that doesn't mean he's done with climate change. Doesn't mean he's not a globalist anymore. Doesn't mean he doesn't have a conflict of interest in his portfolio. He does, because he's a phony. He's saying whatever he needs to in order to win this election. Don't forget, Mark Carney's hands aren't clean of Justin Trudeau's catastrophe. He was in the room. He was the third man in the picture, just close enough to exert influence but far enough away to avoid the PR disaster. And speaking of PR, I just heard some interesting news about the Liberal slander factory called Protecting Canada. It seems like they might just be Russian. They're a well-funded organization that has been campaigning against the Conservatives since the days of Erin O'Toole, and they spent tens of thousands of dollars on Facebook ads against Pierre Poilievre in recent days. David from the channel Moose on the Loose has more details, and from what I can tell, I think he's the one who even cracked the story. I'll link his video in the show notes. And honestly, this is just the beginning of Carney's PR disaster. The Liberal Party recently announced he will not be participating in the French leadership debate on the TVA network, though he will be in the English debate. This is a bad move for him. Dropping out of debates usually doesn't end well. But for Carney, he's stuck between a rock and Pierre Poilievre. You see, Carney isn't a very smooth politician. Justin Trudeau at least has the advantage of being a decent public speaker, and he could engage with Pierre Poilievre on the battlefield of charisma, if not the battlefield of ideas. Mark Carney doesn't have that. In the same Moose on the Loose video I mentioned earlier, David points out Mark Carney's tells. He has an uncontrolled gesture when he's lying or at a loss for words. And this gives us a very easy way of knowing exactly when he's about to implode on live television. So, on April 28th, I am urging you, yes, you specifically, right now, listening to this, vote. Do it. I'm not going to pretend that this is the last election if you don't vote Conservative and scream about Canada becoming a dictatorship, because it is hard to know what this country will be like in 10 years. But vote so that the Canada in 10 years doesn't stay on the same trajectory it has been on for the last 10 years. All right, so in the original recording, I missed something about Marky here, so I'm going to add it on right now. The real big thing is that his wife and his brother-in-law are in Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book. Again, the creator Moose on the Loose has some info on it, so I will link that video in the show notes as well. But I think the big takeaway from this is it's bad, okay? Nothing good has ever come out of Epstein Island, and the whole list out there is really nice that we can see who went there and we can catch people. And there's a lot of people who were like, oh, wouldn't have thought they were taking visits to Epstein's Island. Now, I don't recall Mark Carney's name explicitly being in that book, so I'm not going to lobby any accusations at him. But the fact that his wife and his family are both in the book makes it really suspect, to say the least. It's actually such a big deal that Rebel News is driving around a truck with a big picture of Mark Carney standing next to Ghislaine Maxwell, who maybe has a less identifiable face, but if you know who she is, then you know it's really, really bad to be caught with her. And the crazy part is, the photo was taken at Mark Carney's house in England while he was the governor of England. So the news of this has spread, as it should, that while Mark was at a rally, he's speaking in his terrible French, someone in the crowd yelled out, in English mind you, "How many kids? to which the whole crowd was like, ooh, they were not happy. So they probably like beat him with their elbows up or something, or stabbed him with a COVID vaccine, whatever it takes to subdue him. Okay, so at this point in the show, I'm going to send it over to Bennington. He wrote up his own monologue, and yeah, here it is.
All right, folks, Bennington here. Now, I have a lot to get to, so hold on tight. So, as everyone is most likely aware by this point, Mark Carney has succeeded Justin Trudeau as leader of the Liberal Party and as the 24th and current Prime Minister of Canada. But let's focus on the main question here. Is Mark Carney going to govern any differently than Justin Trudeau? The short answer to this question is no, and allow me to explain why. Carney is certainly more intelligent and capable than Trudeau, but I mean, that's not as great as it may sound on the surface because the bar has been set incredibly low. I mean, a trained chimpanzee would probably have been a better choice. But when you look at their political ideas, their personal views, and their preferred policies, Carney and Trudeau are remarkably similar. They're both pro-government intervention. They're both distrusting of privatization and free markets. They're both favorable towards wealth redistribution. They're both supportive of radical environmentalist policies, woke ideology, and political correctness. The list goes on. So here are a couple examples. According to a National Post article published earlier this month, Carney has long been linked with radical environmental ideas and policies that are both costly and unattainable. One idea, of course, being climate change, one of, if not the favored cause by the Liberal Party that they claim they can solve. Carney previously served as the United Nations Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. He chaired the United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2021. He supported the concept of net zero climate solutions and even founded a financial alliance for net zero emissions. He's also backed a sustainable world economy, or a values-led economy, whatever that means, really. In March of 2021, Carney published a book called Values, Building a Better World for All. A communist name for a communist book by a communist. The book, I mean, I've read the synopses where I can find them, and the book essentially encourages a country to give up their sovereignty because it's, encouraging, obviously, a global government system. He mentioned in a 2021 interview with Strategy and Business, and I'm quoting here, quote, "I'm optimistic about sustainability and the road to net zero in the sense that it provides an opportunity to realign our social values and value in the market," end quote. He also talks about supporting a values-based leadership to drive this transformation, as well as, quote, "effective governance and policy by leveraging the social solidarity we saw develop over the pandemic," end quote. Who does this sound like to you? And now, I don't know, but it sure sounds like Trudeau to me. Trudeau said in a statement for World Environment Day in June of last year, and I'm quoting again, quote, "It is our collective responsibility to protect, restore, and preserve the environment for our children and grandchildren. From combating unprecedented wildfires to ensuring clean air and fresh water, we remain steadfast in doing whatever it takes to protect our planet," end quote. Now, this obviously helps explain why the environment has been Trudeau's biggest pet project. Over $100 billion, that's billion with a B, over $100 billion in taxpayer funds have been spent on climate change policies alone. And he's focused relentlessly on, you guessed it, working towards a goal of net zero emissions by the year 2050, just like Carney's doing now. And now Carney's talking about removing the carbon tax, which he claims to have already done. The fact of the matter is this: Carney has long supported carbon offsets and told the Senate Banking Committee in May of last year that the carbon tax served a purpose up until now. I mean, we can safely say he's changed his tune because Trudeau made this issue unviable. Plus, Referencing that same National Post article, Carney is planning to replace the carbon tax with an incentive system that rewards Canadians for making greener choices. That's hardly an improvement, if you ask me. Here's the deal. Since 2019, $32 billion, again with a B, $32 billion have been accumulated from the carbon tax. I got a question here to, our listeners who are perhaps actually who are voting Liberal or NDP this year. Um, can you show me some evidence? Like, how are they going to use this $32 billion and most likely more to change the weather? I'm open to being convinced, but it sounds like a boondoggle to me. But we'll leave that there for now. Another thing I'd like to talk about is this. Last week, Carney added Century Initiative co-founder Mark Wiseman to his advisory council on Canada-US relations. So let's get up to speed on that. First of all, what is the Century Initiative and who runs it? They are a pro-immigration lobby group founded in 2014, and they build themselves as a diverse, nonpartisan network of Canadians from the business, academic, and charitable sectors who share a vision of a more populous and prosperous Canada with more pull on the global stage. The Century Initiative was added to Canada's Registry of Lobbyists in 2021, but is currently listed as inactive. The Century Initiative was co-founded by Mark Wiseman and fellow businessman Dominic Barton. Now, Mr. Barton went on to chair Justin Trudeau's Advisory Council on Economic Growth and was also tapped by Trudeau in 2019 as Canada's 21st ambassador to China. Mark Wiseman, meanwhile, was a senior executive at BlackRock from 2016 to 2019. Now, you may have heard the name BlackRock before. BlackRock is an investment firm based in New York that's been accused of driving up housing prices by buying up large quantities of homes. Wiseman was let go by BlackRock in the later part of 2019 after failing to disclose a romantic relationship with a subordinate. Kind of a goober move on his part, but whatever. The reason why I mention the Century Initiative at all is this. They are seeking to grow Canada's population, that's the population of the entire country of Canada, to 100 million by the year 2100. Why? To simply make Canada a lot more crowded, it seems like. I don't know. Now, I'll get back to this in a few minutes, but I'd now like to discuss Carney's previous affiliations because let's be honest. Nobody, at least nobody that I've spoken to, really knew who Mark Carney was until January. Now, this next part needs a little bit of backstory, so here goes. There is a Canadian investment corporation called Brookfield, which was established in August of 1997 and has headquarters in Toronto and more recently New York. Brookfield consists of two publicly traded companies. There's Brookfield Corporation, which is the original company, and there's Brookfield Asset Management, which was spun off in 2022. In this case, we're going to be specifically focusing on the latter, Brookfield Asset Management. So the story goes like this. After leaving central banking, Mark Carney served as the chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, as well as its head of impact investing. Now, what does that mean? Impact investing is an investment strategy that seeks to generate financial returns whilst simultaneously creating a positive social or environmental impact. He served in this position for 4 years before stepping down in January to run for Liberal leader. As of recording, today is Thursday, March 27th, as of recording my monologue here. And Carney made a campaign stop in Windsor, Ontario yesterday, during which the subject was brought up that Carney had put two green investment funds in an offshore tax haven while he was still an executive at Brookfield. This comes after Radio Canada reported just yesterday morning that two Brookfield funds personally overseen by Carney were registered in Bermuda, according to relevant filings in the Ontario Business Registry. Bermuda, which has historically imposed no taxes on business profits and capital gains, is a well known tax haven and a common stopping point for complex business ventures that cross multiple jurisdictions. Of course, Carney defended this yesterday and said that the funds were registered to avoid double taxation. One fund was registered in 2021 and the other in 2023, and they were geared toward, or at least claimed to be geared toward, investments in green energy and infrastructure, holding combined assets of $25 billion. That's again, billion with a B, $25 billion. As you can imagine, the conservative campaign was quick to jump on these revelations, with conservative leader Pierre Poilievre saying that Mark Carney hid his corporate assets in Bermuda to dodge the taxes that liberals force on Canadians. He added that the conservative platform will include measures to crack down on the types of tax havens that Mark Carney has used to cheat the system. Sounds pretty good to me. And to add insult to injury, Ripley's, believe it or not, Brookfield themselves have also been accused of using complex arrangements with Bermuda and other international tax havens to essentially stiff the Canadian government out of billions of dollars in corporate tax payments. One international tax watchdog group, I do not know what they're known as, but they said in a report that dates back 3 years ago that Brookfield may actually now claim the title of Canada's top tax dodger. There seems to be an apparent pattern of aggressive tax avoidance that is consistent across Brookfield's global operations, and it honestly comes as absolutely no surprise to me to find Carney's name all over this. So, if Carney cares about our country, what's he doing avoiding paying taxes in Canada by hiding his money in tax shelters in Bermuda? Now, I'll leave that for you listeners to decide. But that was then. What about what's happening right now? Now, as of recording this, a snap election has been called, and Canadians are off to the polls on April 28th. And Carney, the front runner, at least right now, just so happens to be a man who has never been elected to public office and has never faced Parliament once. He isn't even an MP. But he did call for an election on Monday, March 24th. So the prorogation of Parliament has ended. It's been paused, as everybody knows, and he is now tasked to reconvene the Commons. However, here's the dangerous part. If Carney would have called an election earlier, say last weekend, like the weekend prior, so the 22nd and 23rd, it would have been precisely so he did not have to go through a by-election where he would be the sole focus of public scrutiny. He wouldn't have had to face Parliament before Canadians could cast their ballots. Voters would not get to see Carney under fire. They would have been given no evidence whatsoever of how well he might be able to govern or not. They would see none of his policies in real life. The question of whether his ideas are likely to be successes or mostly failures, as with his predecessor, would never be answered. Voters would essentially have been asked to turn over government to the Liberals for another 4 years, based solely on Carney's promises to do better than Trudeau, even though, get this, Carney has most of the same caucus, staff, and campaign strategists as Trudeau. Now, why would this have been the case? Why would this have been dangerous? Because up until Monday, the federal parliament prorogation was still in effect after Trudeau stepped down. As I mentioned, parliament was on pause. On the other hand, Carney would have been a lame duck if he had waited until October, because he wouldn't have been able to vote or speak in the legislature due to him not having an electoral seat, as I stated earlier. So the whole of the Liberals' strategy seems to be, we've changed from the stupendously incompetent gang that ran the country into the ground over the last 10 years. You can definitely trust us again. And speaking of trust, Carney is also refusing to disclose his assets, as I previously mentioned. Indeed, he is calling on voters to trust him that he has no ethical violations or potential conflicts of interest. Go to the polls, elect him first, then you'll get to see his investments. One of Carney's, in fact, one of his major promises to date has been job creation. Elect him and his government will get Canadians back to work. But how? Like, what exactly is his plan here? Will he cut corporate taxes to encourage companies to expand and hire new workers? Will he increase write-offs for modernized machinery and manufacturing technology to improve productivity? I don't know. Nobody knows. Canadians will just have to trust him, won't they? According to, Lauren Gunter from the Edmonton Journal, the Trudeau government created such an anti-investment atmosphere in Canada that we had the lowest productivity increases of any G7 country in the past decade. Think about that for a second. The lowest productivity increases, I'm going to repeat that, of any G7 country in the past decade. The International Monetary Fund says that during said lost decade of the Trudeau government, Canada's per capita GDP did not budge an inch, while in the United States, theirs grew by more than 20%. It seems to me that, Trudeau's government spent far more time virtue signaling and woke apologizing for every perceived past wrong of their ancestors than it did actually building a robust economy. And since Carney is surrounded by many of the same advisors and MPs, Canadians would be right to assume that his social and economic policies will be much the same. A big problem with, affordability, economic growth, housing, and overused public services in Canada has been the Liberals' open door immigration policy. Of course, Carney says he will change that, yet he just added Mark Wiseman to his Canada-US Advisory Council, who is the co-founder of a group that seeks a massive increase in Canada's immigration levels that will triple the population of the entire country. This is fork in the garbage disposal level mayhem here. According to the Century Initiative website, Toronto should grow, listen to these numbers, okay? Toronto should grow from 9 million to 34 million, Montreal from 4 million to 12 million, and Vancouver from 3 million to 16 million by 2100. As preposterous as this is, Wiseman and his group justify this by insisting it will reduce the burden on government revenues to fund healthcare, old age security, and other services. These are the sort of minds that Carney has around him. And I don't know about you lot, but I'd much rather put my faith in a remote-controlled traffic cone than another prime minister from this progressive globalist group mindset. So there you have it, really. Carney and Trudeau are virtually two sides of the same political coin with only small differences at best. With one notable exception, though, Carney, being more intelligent and capable than Trudeau, could potentially and most likely cause more damage to Canada's political environment, economic engine, and our way of life. And in my personal opinion, that's something that all Canadians should be concerned about. In short, Trudeau was the puppet. Carney is the puppeteer. And just for you guys to remember, you put lipstick on a pig, you still have a pig. Pretty self-explanatory. So this is my question to all our Canadian listeners. After 9.5 years of Justin Trudeau, don't you think it's time for a change?
Thank you for listening to the Basement Podcast. If you like this episode, please share this with your friends, your family, and your liberal cousin, because this election is going to affect 40 million people, and let's make sure it's for the better. Bye.